The year 1944 represented a turning point in the Second World War when battles in places like Stalingrad, Monte Cassino, Normandy, Saipan, Peleliu, and Leyte became seared into the memories of a world at war. But another battle fought that year was nearly forgotten. Between February and March 1944, the United States Army Air Forces fought a desperate struggle in some of the most extreme conditions of the Second World War. And while that battle was different than those others, it was perhaps as important as any of them. The 1944 Battle of Kansas deserves to be remembered. The war in the Pacific was quite different than the war fought in Europe. Among the differences were the vast distances involved, requiring different technology. The initial idea was grounded in the thinking that had been derived from the war in Europe. R. Ray Ortenzi of the United States Air Force Material Command History Office wrote on the webpage of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in 2018. During the late 1930s, hemispheric defense was a popular phrase when the war in Europe began to arouse public opinion in the United States to the dangers of Axis aggression. The hemispheric defense was the entire western half of the Atlantic Ocean that President Franklin D. Roosevelt had declared part of the Western Hemisphere and thus neutral, with the U.S. Navy patrolling the area to disclose locations of German submarines to the British. However, here in Dayton, Ohio, at Wright Field, a young captain with Material Command, Donald Putt, interpreted the phrase hemispheric defense in aggressive terms by drawing up a statement of military characteristics which envisioned a bombardment airplane with greater bomb capacity and longer range than any airplane ever conceived before. Impressed by the German use of strategic bombing over Britain, President Roosevelt perceived the need to rapidly build up the United States Strategic Bombing Force, requesting in a message to Congress on 12 January 1939 the enormous sum of $300 million to build up the U.S. bomber force. Hortense continues, at the recommendation from Secretary of War Henry Stimson, Hap Arnold, on 5 May 1939, established the Kilner Board, named after Brigadier General Walter Kilner, to make recommendations for future development and procurement programs. The board returned in June, recommending aircraft and equipment to be acquired by 1944, which included a very long-range heavy bomber. In a 1999 monograph written for the School of Advanced Military Studies of the United States Army Command and General Staff College, Air Force Major Gerald S. Gorman explained the specific challenge in terms of strategic bombers. With its unique silhouette, 4 big engines, impressive defensive armaments, a range of over 2,000 miles, and an average speed of 233 miles per hour, the B-17 Flying Fortress became perhaps the most famous airplane in the history of the Air Corps. But even the improved performance characteristics of the B-17 and other bombers like the consolidated B-24 Liberator were inadequate for the operational demands of the Pacific Theater. What was needed instead was a very long-range bomber that could exceed 3,000 miles in range, with a significantly larger payload. Consequently, the Army Air Corps issued a specification for a new super bomber in December 1939. Design proposals were submitted in 1940 by manufacturers Consolidated, Lockheed, and Douglas. But the design that quickly impressed the Air Corps was the proposal by Boeing, called the XB-29. By May of 1941, the Air Force had made an initial production order of 250 aircraft. Major Gorman explains the significance of the super bomber. The B-29 was on the cutting edge of aircraft technology when first flown in 1942. Twice as heavy as the B-17 with a crew of 11 men, the B-29 could carry a 20,000-pound bomb load a distance of over 3,000 miles at a speed 30% faster than the B-17. Air and Space Forces magazine writes that Boeing created the ultimate World War II bomber. The Air Corps ordered more than 1,500 of them before the first one flew. The advantages and challenges of the B-29 were vast. The largest engines available at the time of the aircraft's development, pressurization of large crew areas allowing high-altitude flight, advanced targeting radar on the northern bomb site allowing precision delivery of munitions on target, and remote-controlled defensive gunnery that Gorman describes as in a class all its own that justifies the name Super Fortress. But, the major notes, the advanced features of the B-29 taxed the limits of American aircraft industry. It was in fact so advanced that designers at Boeing themselves were uncomfortable with the aircraft, feeling that they were going too far forward in the technological unknown. Writing in his 1988 book Super Fortress, The Story of the B-29 in American Air Power, General Curtis LeMay noted, The logistic problems inherent in producing a plane as complex as the B-29 would have been monstrous under the best of conditions. But the B-29s had to be produced quickly, and this led to their starting to roll off the assembly line before all the engineering changes were made. In his 1963 book, The B-29 Story, author Gene Gurney writes that in the summer of 1943, some industry leaders were urging that the B-29 be discontinued because of the serious defects that were showing up. These obstacles ran into the exigencies of war. Air and Space Forces magazine wrote in 2012. President Roosevelt was concerned that China, hard-pressed by the Japanese since 1937, might drop out of the war. At the Cairo conference in November 1943, he pledged his word to Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek that B-29s based in China would bomb Japan by the spring of 1944. This was an imperative, as the magazine notes. The B-29 was needed to keep China in the war until Japan was brought to its knees. Major Gorman explains, the first call for strategic bombing operations in the Pacific came as a result of the Casablanca Conference of January 1943, as a remedy for the desperate position of the Chinese government and the inability of the Allies to administer help in any other way. In August 1943, the Air War Plans Division prepared a plan for B-29s operating from rear bases in India and forward bases in China against Japanese lines of communication and Japan proper. To conduct this campaign, the JCS created an entirely new organization, the 20th Air Force, under the command of Commanding General, Army Air Force Henry Hap Arnold. General LeMay noted the timeline. To meet the promises made to Chiang Kai-shek, the first combat-ready B-29s would have to be flying out of Smoky Hill Army Air Force Base in Salina, Kansas, on March 10th, 1944. And so the Allies had a plan for the strategic bombing of Japan that had a critical timeline that was essential to the survival of a desperate ally. And yet that entire plan depended upon the B-29. And not one single B-29 that had been delivered was yet combat-ready. Ortens writes that in January 1944, of the 97 aircraft that came off the production line, only 16 were serviceable. LeMay continues, there were 54 major modifications that had to be made to every B-29 that came off the line in 1944. The areas affected included the electrical system, the fire control system, the propeller feathering system, the tires, and of course the engines, the most complex part of an incredibly complex aircraft. These changes would have to be made on the flight line, and the necessary parts were spread out in sub-assembly factories all over the country. The problem was not merely theoretical. LeMay explains that General Henry Hap Arnold, chief of the United States Army Air Forces, flew into Smoky Hill on March 8th. When Arnold inquired how many B-29s would be ready to leave for India on March 10th, he was told, none. He was livid. Ortens writes that during the visit he found the production in a shambles, void of organization, management, and leadership, with individuals unclear where missing parts and equipment were located. The aviation history website Tales Through Time explains that all the available flying B-29s were being used for crew training and as such, and many of them weren't even fitted with the defensive gun system, let alone any of the other systems necessary for combat. Even worse, there was a shortage of qualified B-29 mechanics to get any aircraft combat ready. LeMay concludes, I was appalled at what I found, Arnold said later. There were shortages in all kinds of classes of equipment. The engines were not fitted with the latest gadgets. The planes were not ready to go. It would be impossible for them to be anywhere near China by the 15th of April unless some drastic measures were taken. The Saturday Evening Post reported on August 25th, 1945, that Arnold then exploded a string of impossible orders that set phones jangling all over the country. Gurney writes that phones began to ring all over the country. What's the dope? Arnold wants every part required to complete modification. No, not next month. Tomorrow. Tomorrow morning. The Kansas Historical Quarterly explained in November 1945, so began an uproar famed as the Salina Blitz, or the Battle of Kansas. Arnold put his own deputy, Major General Bennett E. Myers, in charge of the battle. Ortens notes that contractors and subcontractors were directed to stop everything and get missing aircraft parts flown immediately into the bases in Kansas. LeMay writes that Myers spent the next 5 weeks on the telephone, begging, threatening, and sweet-talking the firms, in many of which he owned stock, whose cooperation meant the difference between success and failure. Benny Myers demanded, and the vast archipelago of suppliers responded. Gurney writes that Myers asked for no paperwork except simple notes about work completed, and hours were to be as long as a man could stand on his feet. The last plane was to be ready to leave no later than April 15th, armored and fully equipped. The Kansas Historical Society continues. Overnight, Kansas swarmed with tough colonels. GI mechanics flew in from a dozen states, and Boeing sent 600 civilian experts from the Wichita plant. LeMay explains that for Hap Arnold, the Battle of Kansas was no clever euphemism applied to a logistical setback. It was Stalingrad. It was a battle that could not be lost. The task was enormous for many reasons, one being that few hangars were large enough to accommodate the massive bombers. Much of the work had to be done outside. Air and Space Forces magazine writes, most of the workforce had been battling the long Kansas winter for months, working outside with temperatures hovering between 2 below zero to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Even as spring approached in March, the weather continued to hamper the work effort with large snowfalls. Often the cold was so severe that workers could work no longer than 20 minutes at a stretch before going to warm up at one of the small gasoline heaters studding the flight line. The Saturday Evening Post wrote that they worked outdoors in a wintry gale. Hangars were scarce. The wind hissed with sleet. Loose cowlings flapped and clattered and sailed away. Gasoline heaters were flown in, and every shivering man was issued a high-altitude flying suit. The Kansas Historical Society writes that delicate fire control mechanisms were delivered to waiting B-29s in soft-sprung ambulances. Spare engines were hoisted into bomb bays, and one B-29 was ready, and then another. Gurney writes that General Myers was constantly on the phone, calling Chicago, Oklahoma City, New York. Air Transport Command planes were arriving in a steady stream, delivering parts for the B-29s. Tales Through Time writes that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 35 straight days, the first group of B-29s were readied for combat in some of the most atrocious winters in Kansas history. By the end of the month, the Battle of Kansas was won. Hortense notes that the pell-mell project finally turned around under General Myers, and in late March, the first B-29 was turned over to 20th Bomber Command and departed for India, with roughly 150 planes departing for the China-Burma-India theater by the end of April, and then moving into China. After the Battle of Kansas, the B-29 continued to suffer from various problems, including engine overheating. Initial raids that came from bases in India and China did so little damage that Japan determined that the cost of the program to the Americans had exceeded the plane's strategic value. But as the war in the Pacific progressed and America captured bases that were closer to Japan, the Army Air Forces were able to supply larger numbers of bombers. And as General LeMay shifted the strategy from high-level precision bombing to low-level firebombing, the value of the B-29 became clear. Air and Space Forces magazine writes that under LeMay's leadership, the B-29 came to symbolize air power. General Thomas S. Power, commander of the U.S. Air Force Strategic Air Command, remarked in 1963, "Throughout the history of warfare, some weapon or device usually has been credited with a more decisive role in achieving victory than most other factors. If such a role can be attributed to any particular weapon system in helping to win the war in the Pacific, it was the B-29. Of course, it was B-29s that dropped the atomic bombs that are largely credited with ending the war. Ironically, the B-29 program, which cost some $3 billion for development and production, the most expensive program of the war, dwarfed the cost of the $1.9 billion Manhattan Project that built the bombs that they dropped. The B-29 continued to be important in American bomber strategic forces after the war, wasn't officially retired from the United States Air Force until 1960. But all of that might have been abandoned were it not for a lonely, forgotten battle fought in America's heartland. General LeMay concluded, "The Battle of Kansas was typical of a number of efforts that Americans made at home and abroad during World War II. When the chips were really down, the work went on, night and day." I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on Forgotten History, all you have to do is subscribe.